Ladies and gentlemen, the second panel of this afternoon is devoted to capital and market. I would like to introduce to you the panelists. On the very left, Dr. Wolfgang Fink, CEO of Goldman Sachs, Germany and Austria. Then Professor Rudolf Mellinghoff, President of the Federal Financial Authority, in the past a judge on the Constitutional Court in Germany. And then Professor Rocholl, President of the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin. I am Stefan Korioth. I'm a legal advisor or legal professor at the University of Munich. While walking through the city, while driving through the city, I've seen the theater in Salzburg, and they're playing Penthesilea by Kleist. And on the wall of the theater you saw, this is a phrase which really tells us with our topic. Curse the heart which cannot be moderate. I'm sure that you all know this quotation from this play by Kleist. And this actually is the entry to the topic which we are going to discuss. And I thought that words market and capital have become words which irk people. You see, in continental Europe and in Germany, these words have got negative connotations with those who were asked what they think when they hear these words. If we add growth, and this was something which we heard a lot about during the last presentation, then this is a third word which irks people. So curse the heart which cannot act moderately. Now, what about growth? Can you explain? Does our economic system need growth?
Yes, criticism of growth is seen everywhere, especially when you consider the consumption of resources. Too many resources are being consumed. And this might appear to be logical at first glance, but if you take a closer look, you will see that growth is a prerequisite for a number of different things, and I'd like to talk about them right now. Firstly, the question of state indebtedness. A lot of measures are fighting this, but none of them is as easy and pleasant as economic growth. This is a possibility to eliminate your debt, and this is the simplest way to go about it. And then criticism of growth, or let's say this takes on a very clear-cut position, and they forget to notice that not all countries are in a situation similar to the one in Germany. There are countries that are in a position because of growth to fight poverty, to help to eliminate poverty. We saw that in China. China is an excellent example of how hundreds of people and millions of people have been able to escape poverty and to enjoy economic prosperity. There are also a number of countries who need prerequisites and preconditions in order to deal with this. In other words, think about climate change and how countries like Bangladesh or other countries deal with this, or countries that are faced with major challenges. And one more point, and that is decisive. And I would like to criticize the paper we just heard. How much of this is determined by individuals, or how much can be implemented by a state? So if you want to conclude that you want to have less growth, then you can't just limit growth per se, because that's just an output variable. You have to work on the input variables. You would need regulations on how much we work, what kind of work we do, etc. This would be a system or a social system that we would not be good for any of us.
Well, yes. Listening to some of the arguments mentioned just now, I have the impression it is not only about the market, but it also, affects the state. The government Obviously, there are some interdependencies, and it is a group of questions which I would like to address or ask you to answer. Is there a connection between the public sector, the government sector, and market? Are they entangled, or how would you determine the relationship?
The market requires rules. Without rules, a market won't work. And that's why we need somebody to enforce these rules. That's done by the courts in a country under the rule of law. And the big question here that we have to ask ourselves is, and this is because of China, and I also read an interesting article on this on Friday, and that is the democratic system superior, or does the example of China show us that maybe we have another model which might be superior? Well, I would say that human rights are universal and self-determination are things that will also lead to and be enforced even in globalization, because economic growth will only be produced in peace as long as the society goes along with this. And if, for instance, you take a look at China, things are moving upwards there, but this is just over a short period of time, and we don't know where it is going to end up. Everything needs to be regulated, that is correct, but the problem that we now see is that long existing, or some democracies that have existed for a long time, tend to over-regulate, and that is a problem. And in Europe, we often have to consider the individual states. The question is, in Europe, will we be able to have deregulation on a European level, which the individual states will accept?
There's one question I have. Follow-up question, because I believe you constrain yourself when answering. Correlates democracy with economic success or not?
Ich frage jetzt nach den Realien.
It should. I'm just asking for the actual situation. Well, economic excess will exist temporarily without it, but not on a long-term basis. I just asked Mr. Lin a minute ago, and he said to me, in China, there will be democracy in the long term, but it would be Chinese democracy, if I understood him correctly. So that means that we will have democracy, but we're really excited to see how this democracy will develop and how it will be adapted to the society.
Dr. Fink, now let's get out of the public sector. How do you see the task of instances like banks, when it comes to making available capital? What is their task? What is their function, particularly after the experiences which we made over the last decades?
Well, this, of course, is a complex question. But the first point is, in my opinion, this is a question of capital, market, and growth. Here we talk about capital market. You're talking about the financial capital market. Now, capital is looking for growth, and you won't find any investment project which doesn't have growth, which would be easy to finance. We both invest, and there won't be any growth, but at the end of the day, I have the largest share of that. No, that won't work. What you need is profit. You need a yield. You have to give this premises that there will be a yield. Capital wants growth, and there's an interesting question here. Is capital that is not used, is it dead capital? Is that something you don't want? And resources that are not being used for productive growth? Well, we have had a discussion on this when we talked about negative interest rates on cash. Well, the capital is looking for growth. It promotes growth. The second point is the capital markets should have efficiency in terms of allocation. In other words, if they see great chances for growth with the given conditions, that's where the capital should go. Sometimes it works. It doesn't always work. And the third point is the role of intermediaries, the banks. what kind of a role do the banks play. That is the most pleasant task of banks, and that is to play the intermediaries. And they do this some better than others for various reasons. And that's why one of the major demands we have is that the capital markets should become stronger, that they should be independent of the banks so the whole process can be more fluid and then to create growth.
All right. Now I would like to start a second round of questions coming back to an issue which has been raised and played a role several times. But, it was not obvious or evident, and it refers to another emotive or stimulus word, because if you look at these issues, and I'm sure you know the respective discussions, facts are controversial or contested, and the discussions about these issues is that the inequality between the individual social strata is on the increase in developed countries. I do not want to discuss whether this is correct or not correct. So completely independent of this, and this is a question I'd like to put to the three panelists. Now, how can we achieve, let's say, if there is a connection between the political and the economic systems, now how can we achieve that more people benefit of economic growth? Now, is there a recipe, a route? Certainly not a general recipe, but is there something which we can do in order to, to have more or all people benefiting or profiting from economic growth? And I leave it open. More growth means more inequality. Mr. Procher, you.
I don't believe that is the case, and I'd also like to refer to the presentation we heard a minute ago, and I'd like to shed some different light on that. If you consider the development of wages in Germany, you will see that these are lower than in other countries, and this is certainly due to the fact that there is an agreement between labor and management and that the real wages would not go up as much, but it also meant that the number of the unemployment rate has fallen considerably. If you consider the situation in 2005 with 5 million unemployed and compare that with the situation today, then you say that this is clear progress. In other words, the question is, the way I see it, is that, first of all, this is an excellent target if you can reduce unemployment and thus reduce the lack of equality. But if you look to the future, we're faced with this following situation. Do we want to do this just by means of redistribution, or do we want to talk about coming up with the prerequisites that the disruptions that we're facing right now be addressed? For example, invest much more in education and further training, come up with the necessary situation on the capital markets. And we shouldn't just look by the side when all of the large search machines are working and online companies are in the United States or in China. And Europe is basically like not all that necessary. So the question is, we're talking about the question of inequality. Do we want to talk about this in terms of distribution, or do we want to focus more on the questions of growth and tapping new possibilities?
Mr. Fink, your signal agreement, if I understood you correctly?
Also wieder kein Wachstum. Sie hatten es gerade erwähnt.
You just mentioned that, and then we're talking about the question of distribution, and that becomes very difficult. And I am not an expert here, but if I take what I have and administer it and say there are other aspects, individual prosperity, but we have to distribute what I have, then it's hard for me to present my arguments. What is the mechanism? How do I do this? If I take a look at growth, as Professor Lin just said, of course that means open economies, international trade, no protectionism, and this means that it would be possible on a long-term basis to let more parts of the population participate in prosperity, which means that we might mean a loss of industries. It could mean changes in the sectors. we could say, promote startups more than we've done in the past, much more efficient capital markets. These are things that I can control. I don't know where the innovations will come from, but we can consider the input factors and organize them as best we can. And on this basis, we can say, I will increase participation so that more levels can benefit from this growth. The question is, will we manage transmission efficiently so that we can make the most of what we have to distribute?
Yes, but the route you describe also entails a development which is not synchronous. So this obviously means that you need a society who can, has got a high level of cohesion, can withstand all this. Can you put it like this?
Gesellschaftliche Frage.
Absolutely. You're asking questions that relate to our society. This transfer, we've had this discussion, the phasing out of gold or of coal or mining or the steel industry. This is a discussion that we will have to have so that this does not lead to social distortion. But of course, we will need to have these discussions. We can't stop them. They will come with international distribution of work, of labor, as well as internationalization.
Well, it always depends on the framework within which you see this. Inequality has been on the increase, but if you look at it from a national point of view, then of course, on account of economic developments, and this refers to what you said, that certain situations change. But if you then take an individual perspective, just look at one person, then our state offers some kind of cushioning effect, and it also helps to redistribute things within a society in order to cushion out any difficulties. And the most essential part here is that the freedom of an individual is maintained, is preserved. And if you discuss these things in political terms, then of course, in the first place, you have to create the foundations that everyone can take part. And in the first place, this means we have to invest in education.
I'd also like to ask you one more thing. I was thinking about this a lot when I heard Mr. Piccaro's presentation. We seem to agree pretty much that if innovation in Europe is to be maintained, then we need to have a European Union that works well. We rely on Europe. Now, Mr. Piccaro gave us a scenario where we see that there are very many different European countries. Is it realistic? If you consider what he showed us and how different the developments are in different European countries and others as well, for example, Romania and Greece, he didn't even mention them, is it conceivable for Europe as a continent, as the European Union, to have an opportunity to come up with consensus so that the population can work together on innovation and all these different possibilities?
I should say that this should be our objective, to make sure in Europe that the integration of the market continues. The studies show that, and not only the studies about the introduction of the euro, but about the development of the internal market. Now, they helped to improve matters for Europe so that the entire exchange, economic growth, all this has been, promoted. And I think we have to see everything against this background, this backdrop. Lots and lots of responsibilities which have an influence on economic development still happen and occur on a national level. Let's say a working or functioning labor market, then have sound state or government finances, make sure that education complies with certain requirements, then this is still within the responsibilities of individual states. And therefore, it is important to, emphasize the responsibilities of the national states.
Mr. Mellinghoff, tax laws. In Germany, we have a pretty uniform tax law, because the federal states don't have any authority there. Now, based on what Mr. Rocholl has just said, would you be in favor of having more tax authority given to Europe? And please try to be brief in your answer.
Auf ein langes Thema.
Nein, Sie können natürlich.
Well, surely tax competency cannot be solved. This issue can be solved without looking at distribution or redistribution. We've got a tax-related competence, but nevertheless we also have got redistribution. Now, if you want to unify this kind of system for all of Europe, then of course you have to take into account everything. So you have to be very clear that in Germany too we have different, widely varying areas or regions in Germany, so there are different requirements. So I think, shall I have a uniform tax system, or shall I leave some latitude or leeway and leave it up to certain regions to come up with adjusted tax systems, agricultural region or other types of regions can then develop?
Herr Fink.
Mr. Fink, very briefly, please. Okay, first of all, with the introduction of the euro, we already began with this process, and I don't think this is reversible. I hope it's not. And the second point is, what are the alternatives? What alternative do we have, considering everything we've heard today? We know that we are taking these two famous elephants, so to speak. Do we want to try to take our niche areas and have our national or the states here in Europe? Do we want to survive in that way? I think, unfortunately, this is a word that's been used again, but I think there is basically no alternative. I hate to have to use that term again.
Yes, thank you. And this opens the Q&A session. Please take a microphone and then give your name, please.
Ben Rutscher from New Ventures Counting. In all of the discussions we've had today, we see how important it is to invest in education. Take a look at this. It says that Europe is not spending enough money on this. Input is there, but there's no output. And think about the discussions in China. They cooperate at the universities in digital aspects. They make 140 universities. They change their curriculum and transform it towards digitization. Maybe we should be having different types of discussions rather than just saying we need to invest in R&D. What about the governance structures at universities? What about the possibilities to have these transmissions that we need? Mr. Fink mentioned that. How can we make all of that tangible? Or aren't we just touching on the surface of all of this? In other words, this comes up with too little output at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. The governance structure, well, that's the next stimulus word or emotive word. I'm a representative of a private university, and surely this is an important issue. But, for two reasons, I believe this is important, and this applies to Germany as well as Austria. The expenditure for education in OECD countries, in Germany and Austria, are below the average, so more should be done. But if you have a closer look at the figures, then you also find out that the reason why they are lower than those in the United States, that there are hardly any private investment in this respect. So the private investment is below the international average. So if, like in the United States, you've got various foundations, for instance, maybe if people would go to greater length to do something in this respect. But on the other hand, there are also major, say, requirements which haven't been tackled yet. You see, or just think, the work-life period is on the increase, so this means everyone going through this work-life period is not really prepared, and therefore we can also say that we cannot, just distribute everything.
Would you like to comment, or should we ask take the next question? Why don't we take the next question? Go ahead. I believe Mr. Berger had asked for the floor before myself. There's no microphone, unfortunately. I have a question. We've heard that the share of income is going down and the share of capital income is going up. So at the same time, we're also talking about lack of justice, inequality when it comes to distribution. So one thing that has not been mentioned would be to ensure that employees have more capital. Considering the savings quota in Germany, this must be possible. But we then tried courageously to buy telecom shares that collapsed. So this means that the employees really were not as interested in investing. But of course, companies could promote this topic, and they could make owning shares part of someone's earnings. That means that at least part of this inequality in distribution could be fought without considering the capital in technology and investments, without weakening that share.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly and voluntarily, because, we do not really want to take away private property. I'm a bit skeptical, I admit. You say it is desirable. But if we invest more in education, then we might have a kind of basis, meaning that people are going to go for this capital, say, investment. But whether this will be useful in the long run, I don't really know.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Because we've seen that the savings rate is about 10%. That's pretty constant. But savings accounts give 0% interest. I think it would be more productive to invest it elsewhere.
Well, there's another point, and this is certainly part of economic education. Maybe we could bring things together. The risk of yields, here, of losing yield, this is something which we have to eliminate. There's always a chance of returns of yields, and of course you cannot, as a state or government, cannot protect everything. So I think it's the right route forward. And the second point, when it comes to spreading things, German shares, DAX, this is very, very limited. I also have to invest in European shares. And this will be easy if we've got uniform rules, uniform capital markets, and then people might say, okay, I get used to that. If you focus in Germany alone, then of course the perspective is too limited.
The last question, and please be brief. Considering the sacred cows in our discussions on the euro, no bailouts for countries, no joint debts, no European unemployment insurance, no resource transfers, and considering what we really love, which is the diversity in European cultures, my question is, can the euro survive?
Well, the euro survives because these limits or boundaries are not, adhered to. Very simple. Well, you can see it like this. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you, the panelists, and the audience.